You ever had a moment where something hits you like a lightning bolt? You're brushing your teeth, scrolling through your phone, walking down the street, and bam, you remember what you did, or worse, what you didn't do. You realize you walked away from something that mattered. You shut down, you pushed someone away, and it wasn't because you didn't care. It was because you were scared, and now it's too late, or at least it feels that way. If you've ever been the one who avoids, who pulls away instead of leaning in, then this talk is for you. Because no one ever talks about what happens after, what happens when the avoidant realizes their mistake. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of an avoidant, you need to hear this too. Stick with me, because by the end of this talk, you're going to understand what's really going on inside someone who pushes love away, and why that moment of realization might just be the most painful and transformative thing they'll ever experience. It always starts the same. A random moment, insignificant to anyone else, triggers it. A song on the radio, a photo in an old album, the sound of a laugh that reminds them of someone they used to know, used to love, used to push away. And just like that, they're not in control anymore. The truth slips in through the cracks. The avoidant, the person who kept their distance, who avoided deep conversations, who ghosted or shut down or made excuses, suddenly sees it all for what it is. This is the shock of awareness, and it's not gentle. It doesn't tap politely. It slams into their chest with the weight of everything they've been running from. Because the thing about avoidance is, they don't lack feelings. In fact, many of them feel things more deeply than they're willing to admit, but they build walls, they detach, they rationalize. They tell themselves it wasn't that serious, or that the other person was too needy, too intense, too emotional. They convince themselves they're better off alone, but when that moment of awareness strikes, none of that armor works anymore. It hits them that the silence they chose wasn't power, it was fear, it wasn't strength, it was a shield. They didn't walk away because they didn't care. They walked away because they didn't know how to stay, and now they see what that choice really cost them, and it's devastating, because in that flash of clarity, they realize they hurt someone who cared for them, someone who saw past the mask, someone who offered love, connection, patience, and they didn't trust it, or worse, they thought they didn't deserve it, and maybe they didn't say anything cruel. Maybe they didn't explode or blame. Maybe all they did was disappear. But that vanishing act, it leaves scars. And now, standing there with the weight of their own avoidance finally visible, they realize the damage wasn't invisible at all. It was just delayed. That realization is suffocating. It's like watching a film of your life and seeing all the parts you fast-forwarded through, all the chances you had to do better, the text you never sent, the conversation you avoided, the hug you didn't return, the way you left them on read, not because you didn't want to talk, but because you were terrified of what being open might mean. The avoidant doesn't feel empowered in this moment. They feel exposed, like they're standing in front of a mirror for the first time, really looking and not liking what they see. And unlike before, when denial was an option, now there's no more running. Because the truth isn't just in their head, it's in their heart. It aches, it throbs, and it forces them to ask the question they've never wanted to answer. Why did I push them away? They might not have the full answer yet. But in that moment, they understand that they lost something real and worse. They let it go willingly. That's what makes the awareness so sharp. It's not just that they made a mistake. It's that they made it while believing they were protecting themselves, and now they see they were sabotaging the one thing they secretly wanted all along, connection. Not superficial, play it safe, text you later connection. Real, raw, vulnerable love, the kind that doesn't come around often, and now the realization has arrived like an alarm bell they can't silence. It doesn't go away, it stays, it lingers in every quiet moment. And what they do next, how they respond to this awareness, that's what will define the next chapter of their life. The guilt is unbearable, but no one sees it. That's the curse of the avoidant. After the damage is done, they don't rage, they don't cry publicly, they don't beg for forgiveness, they retreat, but inside. It's a storm. The moment they realize they hurt someone who truly cared for them, the guilt hits like a freight train. It doesn't matter how justified they felt in the moment. It doesn't matter what excuses they made. The silence, the distance, the way they shut down, it all replays in their mind with razor-sharp clarity. They see how the other person tried, how they reached out, stayed patient, waited, and they see themselves pulling away anyway. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how to show they cared, because vulnerability felt like weakness, because needing someone felt like losing control. Now that the moment has passed and the relationship is gone, or damaged beyond easy repair, the avoidant feels something they've been running from their whole life, responsibility, not just for their actions, but for the pain those actions caused. And they don't know what to do with it. There's no playbook for how to apologize when you've spent your whole life avoiding emotions. There's no easy way to say, I was scared and I hurt you, so they carry the guilt alone. They smile at work, nod through conversations, make small talk with friends, but inside they're unraveling. Every laugh feels forced. Every quiet moment turns into a courtroom where they're the judge, the jury, and the guilty party all at once. They start questioning themselves. Why did I say that? Why didn't I reply? Why did I act like I didn't care when I was dying inside? And the worst part, they often convince themselves they don't deserve forgiveness, that they've messed up too badly, that they're not worth reaching out to anymore, so they sink deeper into guilt, and guilt becomes shame. Shame becomes self-sabotage, and suddenly, the very pattern they used to protect themselves has become the reason they're in pain. They scroll through old messages, stare at unread conversations, hover over the send button, and then stop. They can't bring themselves to do it. They think they've probably moved on, or worse, they're better off without me. This guilt, this constant gnawing feeling that they wrecked something beautiful, becomes their shadow. It follows them into new relationships, into quiet nights, into future choices, and the more they try to pretend they're fine, the louder it gets. Because the truth is, the avoidant feels everything. They've just spent years learning how to hide it, even from themselves. But guilt has a funny way of forcing growth. It's not comfortable. It's not clean. But it's real, and when it hits, it demands change. The avoidant can't go back to who they were before the mistake. That version of them, the one who could shut down and walk away without consequence, no longer exists. Because now they know, they've seen the impact of their distance, they've felt the hollowness it leaves behind, and even if they never say it out loud, even if they never apologize, the guilt transforms them. It holds up a mirror, and for the first time, they have to face what they've been avoiding all along. The truth that they were afraid of love, and that fear cost them something real. There's a war that rages inside the avoidant after they realize what they've done. It's not loud, it's not visible to the outside world, but it's fierce, and it's constant. On one side, there's a deep, aching desire to reach out, to fix it, to send the message, to say, I'm sorry, to admit finally that they screwed up and that the silence wasn't strength, it was fear. They want to call, they want to explain. They want to say all the things they couldn't say when it actually mattered. But on the other side, fear, that ever-present fear that's been calling the shots their entire life, fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear that if they open up, they'll lose all control, that tug-of-war doesn't let them rest. One moment, they're ready to speak up. They rehearse the words, they picture the conversation, they convince themselves they can do it. But just as quickly, doubt creeps in and shuts everything down. What if they don't want to hear from me? What if I'm too late? What if they hate me? So instead of hitting send, they stare at the message, delete it, rewrite it, save it in their notes, and then leave it there untouched. The problem is, most avoidants were never taught how to navigate emotional risk. Somewhere along the line, they learned that vulnerability equals danger, that showing emotion is unsafe, that if you need someone, you give them power, and that power can hurt you. So when they feel the pull to make things right, they're also feeling the pull of every defense mechanism they've ever built. It's not just a decision to apologize, it's a decision to tear down walls that have been protecting them for years. And that's terrifying, because the truth is, deep down, avoidants don't trust that love won't turn on them. They want connection more than anything, but they also believe that connection will eventually lead to abandonment, disappointment, or shame. So they stay stuck, frozen between guilt and fear, between the urge to repair and the instinct to run. They go quiet, not because they don't care, but because they care too much and have no idea how to handle the weight of it. And in that silence, they spiral. The longer they wait, the harder it becomes to take action. The story in their head gets louder, more brutal. They're better off without me. I'd only make it worse. I'm not capable of real love anyway, and that voice, that inner critic, wins far too often. So instead of closure, they carry unfinished conversations. They carry what-ifs. They carry the pain of not being brave enough to say, I miss you. They carry the guilt of knowing they left someone confused, hurt, maybe even blaming themselves. And every time they think about reaching out, the fear grows stronger. It's not logical. It's not rational. But it's real, the internal tug-of. War isn't about the other person anymore. It's about whether the avoidant can overcome their own conditioning, their own fears, their own story. And the longer they delay, the more that story cements itself as truth, that they're unworthy, that they're incapable, that connection just isn't for them. So they sit in the middle of that emotional battlefield, silent, ashamed, and unable to move. What no one tells you about being avoidant is that it's lonely, even when you're the one who walked away. After the dust settles and the adrenaline of retreat fades, a quiet emptiness takes over. It's not loud or dramatic. It creeps in during the most ordinary moments, lying in bed at night, walking past a familiar place, seeing something funny and realizing you have no one to share it with anymore. And it's in those moments that the avoidant finally understands they didn't just lose a person, they lost safety. They lost the one place they didn't have to pretend, the one person who saw through the distance and still chose to stay. That kind of loss doesn't scream, it lingers, and it's in the silence that the loneliness begins to echo. Not because no one is around, but because the people who mattered aren't, and not because they left, but because the avoidant pushed them away. See, most people assume avoidants are fine on their own, that they prefer solitude, that they don't need anyone, but that's the biggest myth of all. Avoidants crave connection. They just don't believe they're worthy of it. They've spent so long hiding behind independence and emotional distance that they forgot what real closeness feels like. So when they finally experience it, and then sabotage it, they are left with this crushing contrast. The warmth of intimacy versus the cold of isolation, and it's in that contrast that loneliness takes root. It's not just about missing someone, it's about realizing that the very connection they've always wanted was right there, and they couldn't hold on to it, not because it wasn't real, but because they didn't know how to receive it. Now, every day feels like a reminder, not of what happened, but of what didn't. The conversations that never took place, the laughter that could have continued, the love that could have deepened, it all becomes a weight they carry quietly. They scroll through social media and see that person living their life, smiling, moving on, and it hits them they're no longer part of that story, and even if they pretend not to care, they feel the loss deeply. They just don't know how to express it, so instead they isolate, they keep busy, they overwork, they overthink, they distract themselves with anything that dulls the ache, but nothing really works. Because loneliness, for the avoidant, is not just about being alone, it's about knowing that they chose it, and once that awareness sets in, it changes them. They start noticing how often they push people away, how often they downplay their needs,
how often they keep conversations shallow to avoid getting hurt. And it starts to hurt in a different way, because now the loneliness isn't just the absence of others. It's the consequence of a lifelong habit of emotional self-protection.
And that realization is brutal. It's no longer a question of why did they leave. It's a haunting, honest admission. I pushed them away. That level of self-awareness doesn't feel empowering. It feels paralyzing. Because once you know you're the architect of your own isolation, you can't unknow it. You see every missed opportunity, every closed door, every "I'm fine" that really meant "please don't leave." And now there's no one left to say it to. That's the avoidant's deepest pain. Not that they were abandoned, but that they abandoned themselves long before anyone else did. When an avoidant finally sees the truth, that the relationship didn't fail because the other person was too much, but because they couldn't handle being fully seen, it shakes their entire sense of self. For so long, they've worn detachment like armor. Not showing emotion felt like control. Not depending on anyone felt like strength. They told themselves stories, "I just don't like drama," or "I need space," or "people always leave." But the reality is, when someone finally loved them without conditions, when someone leaned in instead of pulling away, they couldn't handle it. They flinched at affection. They minimized compliments. They questioned the sincerity behind every act of kindness. Why? Because real intimacy exposes the one thing they've worked tirelessly to hide. That underneath the cool, composed exterior is someone who's terrified of being rejected, hurt, or worse, truly known. Avoidants fear emotional closeness not because they're cold, but because closeness threatens the identity they've crafted for survival. That identity says, "I'm fine on my own." That identity thrives on independence, control, logic. But when they are faced with someone who doesn't buy into that performance, someone who sees the soft spots and stays anyway, it triggers a deep internal panic. Because if they're truly seen and accepted, then every wall they've built, every exit strategy they've planned, every piece of distance they've created suddenly becomes unnecessary, and that's terrifying. Vulnerability has never been safe territory, and when it shows up wrapped in real love, it feels like a trap. So they retreat, or they pick fights, or they nitpick and sabotage and push away, not because they don't want it, but because it feels too risky to trust it. After the realization, after the relationship has suffered or ended, the weight of this truth crashes in. They can no longer deny that the person who tried to love them wasn't the problem. It was them, their fear, their defenses, their inability to receive what was freely given. And that realization is brutal because it forces them to face the fact that they didn't just reject a person. They rejected healing. They rejected the very thing they've been longing for. They realized they mistook safety for suffocation, love for control, and support for weakness. And now, looking back, it's clear that love was the real thing. It wasn't perfect, but it was patient. It was kind. It was steady, and they couldn't handle it. Not because they didn't want it, but because they didn't feel worthy of it. That's the core wound the avoidant has to face, the belief that they are unlovable once truly known. So they keep people at a distance until someone finally challenges that belief. And when they push that person away, they're left with the haunting sense that they've proven themselves right. See, I knew I'd mess it up. But deep down, they know they didn't mess it up because they were unlovable. They messed it up because they believed they were. And that belief, if left unchecked, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So now, with nothing left but echoes and regrets, the avoidant has to wrestle with this. If I keep pushing love away every time it gets too close, am I willing to spend my life alone just to feel safe? Or am I ready to confront the fear that's been writing my story all along? What breaks the avoidant the most isn't the silence that follows a breakup or the loneliness that creeps in afterward. It's the moment they realize they were loved exactly the way they always wanted, and they still couldn't let themselves receive it. That moment hits hard. It's not a dramatic scene, not some cinematic breakdown. It's subtle, it's quiet. It happens while folding laundry, driving in the middle of the night, sitting alone in a cafe. Something reminds them of the way the other person looked at them softly with no judgment, of the way they were accepted without having to earn it, and that's what shatters them, because in hindsight they know that love was real. It wasn't perfect, but it was present, it was consistent, and they pushed it away not because it was lacking, but because they didn't feel like they deserved it. For avoidance, this moment of clarity is a paradox. On one hand, they finally see what they had. On the other, they realize they may never get it back, and that thought is suffocating. Because now, they're stuck with the memory of what it felt like to be held without being asked to change, to be heard without having to explain everything, to be loved in the middle of their silence, their mood swings, their disappearing acts. They remember how that person stayed through the distance, how they gave grace without keeping score, and they remember how they responded with coldness, detachment, emotional walls, not because they didn't feel anything, but because they felt too much. And that was the part they didn't know how to manage. So now, the avoidant lives with this haunting contradiction. They wanted to be loved unconditionally, and when it finally happened, they couldn't let it in. It's like starving for years and pushing the plate away when someone finally offers food. That pain is unique. It doesn't just hurt. It reshapes the way they see themselves, because once they realize they weren't abandoned, that they left love on the table, they can't blame anyone else. That level of responsibility is overwhelming. It forces them to look in the mirror and admit, it wasn't them, it was me. And that's where the real grief begins, grieving not just the loss of a person, but the loss of a version of themselves that didn't know how to accept love. Grieving the chances they didn't take, the hugs they dodged, the conversations they cut short, the vulnerability they swallowed down instead of speaking, and this grief, it doesn't go away quickly. It follows them into new relationships. It makes them hesitate before opening up. It makes them question every gesture of affection. Is this real? Can I trust this? And sometimes the memory of that one person, the one who loved them without flinching, haunts them more than any heartbreak ever could. Because they know they may never feel that kind of safe love again. Not because it's not out there, but because they're afraid they'll ruin it again. That's the quiet tragedy of the avoidant who realizes their mistake too late. They carry the memory of a love they once had the chance to hold, and they now live with the ache of having let it slip through their fingers. Not because they didn't want it, but because they didn't yet believe they could keep it. And so here's the truth. The avoidant doesn't walk away without scars. They don't ghost people and move on untouched. What they don't say, what they don't show, is the wreckage they live with afterward. The silent battles, the deep regret, the understanding that they weren't protecting themselves. They were pushing away the very thing they've been starving for their whole life, real, honest connection. And when that realization hits, it's not freeing, it's crushing, because now they have to live with the knowledge that love was never the enemy, fear was. But here's the beautiful part. It doesn't have to end in regret. Awareness is the beginning of change. You can't heal what you won't face, and once you realize your patterns, your fears, your walls, once you name them, you take their power away, you start to choose courage over comfort. You start having the hard conversations, you stop running and start reaching. Yes, it's scary, yes, it's unfamiliar, but the cost of staying emotionally distant is far greater than the risk of being real. So if you've hurt someone, reach out. If you've been avoidant, own it. Not to beg for forgiveness, but to break the cycle, to show yourself. And the people who loved you, that growth is possible, that love didn't fail. Fear just got there first, but now you're choosing differently, because in the end, it's not about never making mistakes. It's about being brave enough to admit them and becoming the kind of person who doesn't let fear decide the rest of their story. That's your turning point. Make it count.